Welcome to Extra Takes, hosted by Northland Church Senior Pastor Dr. Joshua Laxton. Join us each week as Pastor Josh reveals the rest of the story behind his sermons. We'll discuss how those who follow Christ can live out a biblical vision for the church in our world today.
Well, hello, Northland family and friends. Welcome to another episode of Extra Takes. I'm your co-host, PJ, along with Matt Shiles. It is the Tuesday after Easter that we're recording.
This is the Easter edition.
The Easter edition. And I'm still tired from the weekend.
You know what I call these Tuesdays after a holiday?
What?
A Monday holiday?
What's that?
A Moose Day. It's a Tuesday. It feels like a Monday.
Sounds like you're like a farmer. What kind of day is this? A Moose Day.
Moose Day.
Sounds like one of those dad joke farmer dad joke.
There you go.
Yeah, it's Moose Day. Taking care of cows. Who's mooing? Who's Moose Day?
Yeah, I never
That's
thought
what.
of
Yeah,
that.
that's what
you thought of. Okay.
Because my granddad, after he retired from Kimberly-Clark,
Okay.
that's what he did. He basically farmed and had cows, and that's what he did from the time he was 50 until he died when
Really?
he was 80.
How many cows did he have?
A lot.
Like hundreds?
No. I mean, he would always have somewhere between, 20, 30 plus. And it wasn't milk cows. It was like, I guess, beef. I don't even know if beef cow. He just had cows. That's what he loved to do.
Huh. Where was this at?
It's in Tennessee. So I grew up on his farm.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we would always, every year, he would go and he would get me, sometimes my brother, and then my grandma, and sometimes my uncle, and we would have to, I don't know what they call it, but rustle the cattle that he was going to sell. Huh? So all I remember is there was an electric thing that prodder, yeah. And so you had that, and you would go, hooey, hey, you do all that stuff.
So you kind of feel like Yellowstone?
Well, no, they were really roughnecks. I guess they real
like
cattle
not
ranchers.
Like
no, not like that.
Okay.
But, yeah, this was his hobby. Yes, he was good at it, but I mean, but getting me, my brother, my grandma, and my uncle, I just don't know if that were rancher material.
Not sure how efficient that was.
Yeah.
I did not expect to start this way.
Yeah,
that's good. Learning more.
Well, you said Moose Day, so
Moose Day. I never thought of it with cow in mind. Thank you. Now I won't be able to unhear that.
You're welcome.
Well, let's dig into this week. This was our Easter edition, April 19th and 20th. This is making sense of the gospel. So we've been in this series making sense of life in Genesis, and this is specifically making sense of the gospel. Genesis 3, 6 through 13, and 21 through 24. So for the bumper, it changed a bit this week because all the other bumpers had this life is full of questions and laid out the questions. And this one was Easter can raise a lot of big questions. So let me read those for you in case you missed them. Why did Jesus have to suffer and die? Am I really so bad that I need saving? And finally, what does the resurrection mean for me? So this week was all about making sense of the gospel. And the main point was this bad news, good news. So the bad news is that humans chose to love themselves supremely, which led to nakedness and shame, or if you're from Tennessee, nakedness. Sorry, naked.
Yeah, there you go.
Good?
Naked. There you go.
Naked.
Sure. I don't know how it sounds.
So nakedness and shame. Did anyone? Sorry, I just got distracted. Did anyone count the naked word?
Gus told me somebody did.
Yeah, so I had someone come up to me. Oh, I forgot.
I think it was like 90, or not 90.
27.
27.
Yeah.
That's not a lot.
Okay. I was thinking it'd be more.
Not for 45 minutes.
Yeah. So sorry, guys, I got distracted. Let me say that again. The main point. Bad news is that humans chose to love themselves supremely, which led to nakedness and shame. Good news is that God chose to love unloving humans unconditionally so that they may be clothed and saved. So the outline was really, you looked at some housekeeping theological items at first. We looked at the levels of love, the love described, and then the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which was a look back of kind of a previous foundational items that you discussed. And then you laid out these three things to help us make sense of the bad and the good news. And this was human nakedness, and then there was the solution. So what humans do to fix their nakedness and shame, and then what God's solution was. And there's a lot there in all of these points. So I'm looking forward to digging in. So this first point, before we really dig in, you started a little differently than normal, but you started by trying to get us to laugh. You gave these AI
I think I
outfits.
succeeded.
Yeah.
I think I did.
So these outfits, that you would be embarrassed to wear. Very first one, the 80s gym teacher. Funny enough, I was at my parents' in New Smyrna this weekend, and we were watching some of those old VHS tapes that are now on DVDs.
Yep.
My dad was in that exact same outfit, man. Those shorts were like, there they are.
There they are.
So were there any of those that you'd be more willing to wear than the others?
Nope.
Any that you looked at and you're like, that might not be too bad?
Nope.
No.
That's the reason why I shared them.
Not the Mickey ears with the man prees?
Nope.
No,
No man prees. Nope.
And you don't wear skinny jeans?
No. I can't get them off. And that was the thing. I mean, I would not be able to get them off without either taking some surgical scissors and removing them, or it reminds me of when I wear a wetsuit for the Ironman triathlons. I can't get it off. Somebody's got to peel them off of me. And I mean, that's what I think about skinny jeans. I mean, so the regular slim jeans are just fine right now.
Skinny enough.
They're skinny enough. Even sometimes Joni's like, man, they make your calves look big. And I'm like, well, I mean, you can't, calf shaming me? I can't help it. This is the way God made me.
That's pretty funny.
You
know what? I learned something about you.
What's that?
I didn't know you were self-conscious about your calves.
Well, I got some big old calves. I got some big old trees as legs. So it's funny when I would run with some people. I mean, I remember playing with. I remember playing speed golf with this guy in Kentucky.
Yeah.
And he's probably 6'2" ish, just thin. Rail. And so he's like a gazelle, and I'm like, I'm trying to get my little stubby feet and my legs to run, and I'm huffing and puffing, and he's just like, what's wrong? So I'm like, it has to do with every stride of his was like much 3 longer. Strides of mine.
Yeah.
And I got oak trees for legs. Yeah. So a little self-conscious.
Oh man, that was a good way to start though, because it's all about this idea of covering, right? So that was one of the big underlying ideas, or the big idea was this idea of sin and how it leads to shame, and then there's this nakedness that needs to be covered. And what do we do? And really, I was thinking about this question of who is doing the covering. And I think that really sums it up. Are we doing the covering ourselves with all the things that we'll talk about, or are we letting God do the covering through Jesus? So let's look at these first couple questions that we always like to ask. Describe this message in one word.
Covering.
Okay. That's good. So not sin, not shame, but covering.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Is there a big takeaway?
Because that's what the gospel does. The gospel covers you.
Yeah. Well, I think that idea of covering helps to talk about both, right? Because it's not just, we don't want to just dwell on the shame or the sin, but we want to actually recognize that this idea of covering is either done by one of us. Mm-hmm. It's either done by God or done by us. So was there a big takeaway from this message for you?
I think there were a few takeaways, but for me, the biggest one is how I actually ended it, which didn't necessarily have anything. When I say it did, but it didn't have in some sense anything to do with covering. But it had to do with God's love. Is that when you receive God's love and you begin to love Him the way He's created and designed you to love, and you begin to reciprocate that love to others, you actually join Him in remaking the world.
Yeah.
And so that was, to be able to say it that way. I've never said it that way before, and I really like the way that came.
Where did that come from?
Jesus. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
That was a new concept to you?
Well, obviously, here's the thing, though. We know that new creation. I talk about that all the time.
Right.
But to actually now show that he's now remaking, because he has to remake the world now. He's got to, and the idea of remaking is this idea of renewing, restoring, redeeming. But then at the core, and again, this is why Genesis is so important. At the core, his remaking and redeeming the world is actually out of his unconditional love. And then so I think that was a really, really strong way of kind of leaving us with this, in some sense, hopeful Easter message that it's only in Jesus's sacrificial death and resurrection that the world is being remade in unconditional love.
That's awesome. That's helpful to be reminded that that's new. Because when I heard that, I didn't think I had heard that before, but sometimes, you miss things. So it's always great to recognize when a concept that, like you said, has you continually teach on and kind of build on, but when it comes to you in a new way, in a fresh way based on what we're teaching, is obviously a testament to the Spirit working. So it's great. So let's look at these housekeeping items. You looked at the levels of love, love described, and then the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I wanted to look at sin and this definition you gave. You said sin equals loving anything or anyone more than God. And then you said you won't break his commands unless you break his heart, and then you will begin to break his commands. So talk about that idea of breaking commands versus breaking heart, and which one?
Well, it's two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
But I want people to know breaking his commands is coming from the heart that you want it to be all about you. And so therefore you break, so that was the thing about what we looked at in Genesis 3 when Eve, she saw that the fruit was good for food, pleasing to the eye, desirable for gaining wisdom. She took some and she ate it. Her doing that came from her complete affection and infatuation, and now this loving act of I love me. And then she broke the command. Right. So that's what I'm saying, is that it stems from, sin stems from this supreme love of self, which then does move you to break commands. Because my thing is, and this is where I keep going back to, even Jewish religious leaders, even not only at the time of Jesus, clearly, but even Jews in the Old Testament, some of them got confused and going, "Wow, I'm fulfilling the commands." No, you're breaking it because you don't love him. You're doing those commands out of love for yourself. So that's kind of where I wanted people to realize, is that ultimate sin is this unraveling of love for God, which when you have, and this is what we'll see next week, and now, in some sense, throughout the book of Genesis, obviously, and throughout the world, is that when humans unravel their love for God, supreme love for God, it actually unravels everything. So that's what I wanted people to realize, is that, man, it's more about this relational thing than it is this moral transaction. It's not about moral transaction.
Yeah, it seems like when you focus on the breaking his commands, that can lead to religiosity as opposed to the relationship, which you really talked about earlier.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So certainly as there is a brokenness in the relationship because of, our selfishness in a whole host of ways, that of course leads to breaking his commands, because now we're doing what we want to do as opposed to what he's called us to.
You can actually reverse engineer. I hadn't even thought about it until we were just talking. All right, so we break God's heart, break his commands. What does God do? Because if it was more about just breaking his commands, then God would respond immediately with the justice of, I've got to discipline the lawbreaker. Because he has to, because he is a God of justice. Yeah. He is a God of holiness. Yeah. But this is why him being at the core a loving God, we actually see this, because the reverse engineer is that he immediately doesn't kick them out. He immediately doesn't give them what they deserve. What does he do? In this loving manner, he's pursuing them. In this loving manner, Adam, where are you? At the core, God is love. And so even if you reverse engineer after they break his commands, if we're doing transactional things, the next transaction would be, I'm going to arrest you, I'm going to sentence you, and that's going to be it. Going to be done, which is what Satan thought was going to happen.
Yeah.
But that didn't happen. So that's where when even if you reverse engineer from what God does in his response, he shows you that at the core of what he's always wanted was love, because that's what he shows.
Yeah, amen.
So, a couple other little housekeeping items I couldn't get to because it was Easter. I actually wanted to tackle the question, why allow the serpent into the garden to tempt? So we talked about why the tree, but we haven't really talked about why God allowed the serpent in the garden to tempt. So if the serpent is who later on the Bible is going to reveal him as Satan, that in some sense Satan has kind of possessed this serpent, has kind of crawled into the Holy of Holies, because that's the thing too, is obviously if you're listening to this, you've probably been following us for weeks now. We talked about how Genesis 1 is a temple text and how the Garden of Eden was the Holy of Holies. It was the epicenter of God's glory. I mean, so you need to remember all of that. And I can't go into all of that every week because I'd have lost people, so
Yeah.
But you have to remember, so now, Satan has slithered into this epicenter of where God's saturated, when I say glory, presence, name, dwells. Yeah. Okay, so why does God allow? Okay, so two reasons why. First, it was to see if Adam would fulfill his priestly responsibility to guard and keep the garden.
Because that was his role.
That was his role.
To keep it out.
Right, which is why when you see Genesis 3:15, of this offspring going to crush the head of Satan, that's what Adam should have done, which is why I said what I did the previous week is I would love to have seen Adam run that snake out, crush, cut that snake's head off, because a good snake is a dead snake, because that's what Genesis 3:15 talks about.
Right.
So God's allowing this to happen to see if Adam will live up to the responsibility, which is part of that's where even his failure to live up to that responsibility wasn't sin. And let that sink in.
I've never considered it that way.
So yeah, he was the priest that wasn't the sin, because that wasn't a command. That was a responsibility. It wasn't a command. All right. So, but then the second reason is to add one more test, because Satan tempts, God tests.
Yeah.
Okay, so second is to add one more test to see if humans would supremely and primarily love God above all else. So God has not only put the tree in a positive manner. That tree was a positive thing. I love you. Will you love me? Will you choose to love me? But then the serpent, he allowed the serpent to slither on in there or walk on in there, because we see part of the curse is that you have to crawl on your belly, so it's like he cut his legs off. So it's just interesting of that. I'm like, what does that mean? I don't know. Is it figurative? Is it literal? All it is, here's what I definitely know it means, is that Satan lives a defeated life. So he's going to eat dust all of his days. Right. But with him slithering into the garden, it's that one more test. Will you love me, or will you be deceived to love yourself? Because at the end of the day, God doesn't want this transaction or this obligation to love. He wants it to be your own choice. He doesn't want you to be coerced or forced to love him. He wants you to choose just the way he chose to make you in his image and to love you. He wants you to choose to love him. And then the last housekeeping item, and I did mention it, I believe, is the idea of death. Why do we die? But we die. The reason why the animal had to die, the reason why Jesus had to die, was because the punishment of eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was death. So God had told them before they even broke his heart and his command that if you do this, you will die. Okay, so they did it. Somebody has to die. And the animal is going to be the one that dies. And then later on, Jesus will be the one who dies. So that's the reason why we have the gospel, is because we broke the heart of God, we broke the command of God, and therefore we deserve death, we deserve hell, we deserve judgment, we deserve to be separated from God. But yet the good news is that Jesus, through his death and resurrection, he has covered us, and he's in the process of making us new. So so I wanted to kind of start with that just because I wanted people to know that, but I just didn't have time. So
Sure.
We moved on.
Yeah, that's great. So let's look at this first one about human nakedness. This is where you really laid out guilt and shame. You created this distinction. Guilt says, I have done bad, and shame says, I am bad. And you looked at these elements of being human: spirituality, identity, functionality, physique, and psychology. I found this whole area really fascinating. You talked about shame as the human emotion that brings the most stress in our life, and stress can kill, can it? So talk more about. I'm interested in where what you use to study about shame and stress and the effects of stress on our bodies.
Well, I mean, this starts years ago because I've realized that. I mean, in some sense, I've struggled with shame all my life. Just didn't know what it, know what it was until probably about a little over 10 years ago when I was going through counseling and understanding, shame. And it was also at that time I was introduced to Brene Brown, and so she's like the shame expert and vulnerability, and vulnerability is the courage of showing up. And so you started learning about shame there, and then. And then I also combined my understanding of crisis and the idea of crises and what it does to you psychologically, and all of my studies on crisis leadership. I combined those two because shame is this now. It's actually a psychological. It's actually a holistic crisis that you have depending on which area of which area of your humanity you're experiencing shame. Which I would say that we're kind of experiencing holistic shame, which is why I talked about how Jesus takes upon himself the holistic shame, which is why I gave you all the things that he went through. But so that's where I started learning about shame, and then and as I've learned about my own shame and learned about how shame, does affect the human race, and now we're seeing it more prevalent where I don't know if I would say we're owning it well. We just know what it is a little bit more than what we knew 30 years ago. We're naming it now. I mean, I don't know if 30 years ago we were able to name it or even talk about it because we're not necessarily, and I looked this up too, because you have shame-based cultures and honor-based cultures. America was not necessarily a shame-based culture. But it's
guilt innocent.
It's slowly becoming that because we're now identifying all of the shame that we have and cancel culture and all of that type stuff. So that's where it kind of came from, and then being able to kind of dive into that topic. Given the fact that nakedness is holistic shame, and the Bible actually talks about, that. Like that's where Paul was, he's going to say in Romans 8, therefore there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. So, because we want to condemn ourselves, and then other places in the New Testament talks about, covering shame and so forth and so on.
Another topic you talked about was the gut brain.
Yeah.
Where'd you get that idea from?
Yeah, well, so I listened to a whole talk that psychologist Bob Weathers that he gave, and it was interesting. I think he had graduated from Fuller Seminary. Okay. So I didn't, so when I was listening to him, I'm like, let me look at who, and so I looked at his credentials, and I'm like, okay, this is somebody I would trust, from even a biblical worldview. Sure. So he's the one who talked about shame as the human emotion that brings the most stress in our life. And that the stress and the elevated levels of hormones actually stress causes the stress that shame causes is higher than like those things that I listed: adrenaline, sadness, fear, and anger. And that's the reason why I said, like, so when you think about how, and we know this even from a medical perspective, is that if you live under stress, it ages you, it wears you out. Like one of the things I like to talk about in crisis leadership, I actually love to show the pictures of Abraham Lincoln through the years he led through the Civil War. Huh. And he aged 20-something years in 4 years because of the stress that he was under. So if you think about it, so stress can kill us, but if you think about if shame gives us the highest levels of stress and the elevated levels of our hormones, then it could kill you really quickly. If you're wearing shame constantly. So. And then, where I got and then that's where he talks about the heart brain, and then the gut brain. But other people talk about, like a loss of connection, that shame, and because that's one of the things that Brene Brown even talks about, is that when you feel shame, there's this disconnect that happens because you don't want to show up to even people who love you the most. Yeah. You want to hide, and so there's this disconnect. And so that's why people who live in shame that don't want to show up emotionally and they don't want to be vulnerable, there's this actually human isolation, separation, this disconnect that happens, and it hurts your heart. And then, again, if you're experiencing shame, that you've, and guilt too goes into this. But if you feel like you've done something bad, and then you feel like you are bad, and you feel like no one likes you, you get nauseous. So that's where, like, when people get into maybe this pre-routine of public speaking, and they start thinking, well, what will people say about me? They might start to feel nauseous because there's this, what if people don't like me? What if people don't receive me? What if people don't accept me? There's this, you're playing already in your mind what you're perceiving might be shame on you, and so you get nauseous.
Yeah, sick to your stomach.
Yeah.
Oh, man. Well, and as you were saying that, it just struck me that when we're living in that shame and that stress, there's no shalom.
No,
I mean, Jesus wants to take that from us.
Yeah. Well, that's that's the unraveling of order. That's the unraveling of functionality.
Yeah.
That's the unraveling of flourishing. And then that's where I want to really stress what kept functionality and flourishing in place was the love of God and the love for God. But when they
pre-fall,
he
covered it all. Yeah. Every area.
Yeah. That's where and that's where I really wanted to stress that is that he's covering, he's covering our spirituality. Love is love that God has, and the love that we have for God is keeping us connected spiritually. Identity, us understanding that we are God's image bearers, that we're connected to Him. We are His, and we're embodying His characteristics, His attributes, and elements of His nature, and holding that together is love. And then functionality, that we ought to relate with others the way God has related to us. We ought to function from a vocational standpoint, and everything that we do ought to be for the love. We ought to give God our best because we love Him, because He first loved us. So our function, and then when ordering our time and our talents and our treasures, that function as a human being should be rooted in love for God, that we want to honor Him. We want to please Him, with our time and our talents. And then physique, that you are fearfully and wonderfully made, and so that we can receive God's love from just a physique standpoint. And then psychologically is that and so all of the elements of what it actually means to be human, because I want you to realize is that the animal kingdom doesn't have a spiritual connection the way we have a spiritual connection to the Lord. Identity. He's not asking these animals to embody the characteristics and the attributes of God. Okay. When it comes to functionality, they cannot relate, create, and operate the way human beings do. So the animals do not experience the love that God has for the human race the way Adam and Eve did. But when they rejected and they chose to rebel against God and His love, and they chose to love themselves supremely, that is when the unraveling of shalom, the unraveling of order, which is why I talked about all of those crises.
Yeah.
Now, the very first Easter I was here, I talked about humanity's cosmic transitions.
Okay.
And I actually talked about this passage. And so what you have to do, and so this is a major this makes sense of the human race, because this is the major transition that has happened. And so you got to process all of these transitions. You got to process this spiritual transition. You've got to process this now identity, who you are, like, because the human race has lost all of this.
Yeah.
Because they lost love for God, therefore they rejected God's love for them, and so all of these areas are exposed. So, so this is kind of where I put in my notes, like spirituality. That's why we have multiple religions.
Yeah.
That's why some just become agnostic or atheist. Identity crisis. People just don't know who they are, or they seem to be lost. Maybe you've even said, man, you just seem to be lost because you just don't know who they are. They don't know why they're here. A functionality crisis, where you feel maybe like you're a bad husband. You feel like you're a loser dad. Maybe you don't feel like you make enough. Maybe you feel like you aren't successful enough or good enough, or you're dumb. Like that's a functional crisis. And then, a physique crisis, like what's growing on your face. You you body shame yourself, or, you look funny, or you're not pretty, or you wish you looked like, that's a physique crisis. None of that existed before the fall. None of that existed.
Wow.
Depression did not exist. Anxiety did not exist. Suicidal thoughts and suicide did not exist before the fall, because they were enveloped in God's love and loved God supremely.
So. Yeah, and I wrote down that you were saying that, we may be able to cope with shame and have it manageable in maybe one of the areas or some of the areas, but certainly not all the areas. And I think that's a helpful distinction for us to reflect and consider. Some of these areas may not affect us personally as much as others. But we look at that list and we know, this is the area. This is the area, or two areas or three areas that I really feel a lot of shame around. And because of that, I act this way, or I act that way, or it's manifests itself in this way in my life. Yeah.
Well, so you can think about it this way. So maybe you've got work down pat, and so there's no shame, like in some sense you work, maybe because you've hit your stride, or you've gotten to this level. But then you look at, I wonder what kind of dad I've been to my children as I'm building this. Like, I was having coffee with a guy the other day, and he was just talking about his testimony, and decades ago when his kids were younger, he was a very successful business person, and he thought he also was a great father, and he was talking to his 11-year-old. Again, this was decades ago. He was talking to his 11-year-old, and he was just asking them, "Hey, what do you think about Dad? Do you think Dad's around?" And no, you love your work. And so at that point, he had shame. But he didn't stay in it, live in it, because he was a believer. And so he's like, Lord, what do you want me to do so that I can actually have this holistic health in my family? But he thought he thought he was good here. He thought he was good here, but in his home, he wasn't even near what he thought. And so that's where you might cope, or you might have really worked on an area of shame, only to go, when you look in the mirror, like, oh my gosh, I don't look blank. I've let myself go. I've spent. And so. Yeah. It's holistic. So while you might have one area covered, maybe your spiritual area, like if you're trying to do enough good deeds, well, then you're trying to cover that shame, which then that's the whole second point.
Yeah, that's helpful. It may be hard for us to recognize, but certainly our kids, our spouses, our close friends, our family members, they can do a good job of shining a light, shining a mirror to us, and pointing out where there needs to be some change. So yeah, let's look at this next one, human solution to nakedness and shame. This is where you talked about relationships, religion, education and work, money, and substances. I think we could spend time talking about all of them, but a couple things I noticed. The one, relationships, you said it so well at the 11 o'clock when you were talking about, being careful to look for Mr. Right, Mrs. Right, because when we're doing that, we're actually, looking for a God, and humans make crappy gods.
Yeah.
I think that is such a compelling, succinct statement that just really helps, illuminate the point, the facts of the matter. I don't think we mean for that to happen, right? When we're looking for the right spouse, we're looking for the one. Maybe not.
Maybe some people, but I would say,
Maybe,
I would
majority, say. I don't think that's the intention of I'm trying to make them God, but when you lay it out that way, they make crappy gods.
Yeah. Well, I do think that there is this thought that people have is I need to find somebody to complete me, or maybe you can actually see yourself in the reciprocal manner, I need to fix him. So I need to marry him so I can fix him, and so you in some sense see yourself as the fig leaf to actually fix him, or I don't know if men ever, maybe there are men out there who go, I'm going to fix her. I didn't marry Joni going, I'm going to fix her, but I could promise you there's been some times throughout the marriage she's man, she's probably thinking, I need to fix him, I need to show him his but yeah, so as a relationship we go to work thinking that these relationships will give me something. Now here's the thing though, and again I wish I had really more time this past weekend, but when you treat relationships like this, they are transactional. Which is why I actually think that, in our culture today, because again, in our kind of, when I say democratic, self-individualized kind of culture, if it doesn't work for us, we just move on to the next thing. And that's the way we've treated relationships, particularly marriages. And so we've treated them like contracts and transactions. As long as you give me what I want and what I perceive I need, man, we will be fine. Sure. But if you stop meeting my needs, if you stop fulfilling whatever it is that I actually entered into this relationship for you to fulfill, then I'm going to move on. Yeah. So you don't make me happy anymore. What is that? A sign of? It is actually a sign of transactional fig leaves. Is that because you no longer cover me, you no longer make me feel a certain way, you no longer whatever it may be. And so because we've treated relationships like that, that's why I'm almost half of marriages now, at the end of the day, the divorce rate is actually declining because marriages are in decline. People aren't even getting married anymore. Why? Because they treat relationships, even of the intimate sexual kind, as transactions to cover themselves. As long as I can get me some action to satisfy, to please, to fulfill me, listen, I'll keep doing that without, in some sense, this long-term commitment. Yeah. That's a transaction. That is trying to fix human shame in this transactional sense, without having to feel the shame. Because now I don't have to enter into this, whether it's a contract or even a covenant, and then see it break and me feel bad again. Yeah. I can live in this until I'm I don't need to live in it any longer. Then I can move on to the next thing and not have any shame. So that's just relationships.
So for religion, you had this little pithy comment about people hopping in.
Yeah. Well, listen, I'm telling you, I didn't want to be offensive, but at the end of the day, I think there are a lot of people who hop in. Obviously, I mean, you have churches all throughout the world. They experience a heightened attendance on Easter because all of these people are now hopping in. Listen, I want you to hop in. I hope and pray that you heard the gospel, and I hope and pray that people were actually moved and convicted, and God did a work in their life. But I don't want you to hop in only for you to hop in hell later. Like that's not what I want. But we live in a culture and in kind of a society where, hey, I'm doing my religious duty. I'm doing my obligation. I mean, it's Easter. I mean, it's about God, and I believe in God, so I'm just going to hop in, and I'm going to listen. God isn't. He's not impressed by your appeasement of Him. And so that's kind of where I wanted to say that and say religion, and that's where this is actually the first religion right here, is that I'm going to go to work doing some things to actually clothe myself. So that's where when you look at religion is doing things to appease God, hoping that God would receive you as you have made yourself to Him.
Yeah.
And you can't do anything. Like you can't do anything. That's actually, again, that's a transaction. Is like, hey, I've done a little bit of work, on me. Hey, what do you think? Well, no, that God didn't ask you to do that.
Yeah, and you said to that point, you said we're here at Northland, we're not religious, we're relational. And you said there's not enough good works to cover our shame. The only way we can be fixed is through Jesus. Yeah, I mean, I thought you addressed it in a direct but winsome enough way. It's the big elephant in the room. Everybody knows.
Yeah.
Everybody that knows that, they know that they haven't been here in 6 months or since Christmas. Like, that's not a surprise to them.
Right.
And what I think you did well was you didn't just address that, you haven't been here in a while. Because you can address it in a way that can actually feed more religiosity.
Yeah.
You just need to keep coming back.
Yeah.
Right. Well, yeah, that's our heart for them, but like that's not the coming back for what? For more religiosity?
Yeah.
Right? And so I think what you were able to do in that moment is to uncover like what's the purpose behind all this, right?
Yeah.
Like what's the intention, right? And the recognition of like, hey, when you're doing this, and certainly this was just one of the 5, right? So you were talking to every one of us, and some of us were, we're guilty of the religiosity, but on the other end of it, but all of us are guilty of it. But for those that are hopping in, like you're just kind of like pleading to them, like, hey, recognize that this may be an area that you're actually covering your shame, and like if we're honest with ourselves, which I told Kaylee, man, I don't think many of us even give ourselves the time to slow down long enough to feel, to feel our shame. I mean, we're like, the minute we start feeling that shit, we are covering it. Yep. We are covering it.
Well, so here's what I would, and I'm actually going to talk about it even more this coming week in Genesis chapter 4. But if you think about why the religious leaders of Jesus's day were so adamant to get rid of him, was because of religious shame. Is because here's a guy who's saying you don't need to do any of that. Mm-hmm. That you've completely missed the boat. Mm-hmm. And God's looking more at your heart than He's looking at your hands in terms of what you do. Yeah. And so in their mind, if we can get, and then people are flocking to Jesus because of His love. They're flocking to Jesus because of His signs and wonders. They're flocking to Jesus because He's multiplying loaves and fishes, and He's raising people from the dead, and He's giving them teaching that they've never heard because of the heart of the teaching. And so you have these religious leaders now in this shame. So what do they do? They eliminate the object of their shame, and that's what, again, that's where because if they really were satisfied in who they were, And if they really had bought into their whole religious system, who cares what this guy says? Who cares? But no, because underneath there was this shame that they could not tell the public, because if they told the public, then it would completely have undermined the entire religious system that they had built. Because they did not believe that they had it all fixed and that they had it all figured out, which is why, and how do I know this is true? Okay, well, so Gamaliel, later on in the book of Acts, when they go to him, what do we do with all these Christians? He's like, listen, if it's from God, you can't stop it. If it's not of God, it's going to fizzle out.
It's gonna die
at
out.
least in his. So he's very honest. What he's saying is I'm very confident in at least what I'm doing right now. So if it is of God, listen, you're gonna find yourself fighting against God. So at least he's he actually expresses more honesty in the fact that there isn't any kind of, when I say religious shame going on there, just because of the fact that he's not wanting to put a stop to these people because he doesn't see it as offensive.
Yeah.
But the fact that these religious leaders who crucified Jesus, the reason why they saw him as offensive, because he basically attacked their shame. So that's religion.
Wow.
And then work success, this is interesting. All right, so part of this idea of subdue is to take the raw materials and make something of the world. Okay, well, what did Adam and Eve do with fig leaves? They took the raw materials and they made something of the world. So,
which is so interesting, because when I read it in the past, I think I used to read it like they just took a leaf real quick and held it, as opposed to this idea of this process of fashioning it, going to work and making a skirt or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And so that's where you even look at what they did. I mean, they're showing how now human beings will actually use work to actually cover their nakedness.
Yeah.
And that's what we do as humans. We try to use our careers, our vocations, what we do, and what we do actually becomes who we are, because it covers us. And that we see them for the very first time doing that. And then you got money and substances, but that's where I wanted to, say, because this is something that was a little new. When I say a little new to me, a way to look at it, because I had always said, and I always, I'm still hear people talk about the inadequacy of the fig leaves. I've never heard anybody say what actually I said this past week. Now, I'm not saying somebody hasn't said that, but I had always said they're just inadequate, because I would say something funny like, well, what if a big wind came up and it just blew their, it's but that's not it. The reason why they were inadequate was because what made Adam and Eve realize they were naked? Sin. What is sin? It's loving anyone or anything more than God. And then what is sewing fig leaves together a reflection of? They're going to work to clothe themselves. So what is it showing? They're loving themselves.
Yeah, so what you're saying is if they went and killed the animal and made, a cloth just like God did, that wouldn't have fixed it.
That wouldn't have fixed it.
Yeah.
Because they're loving themselves.
Yeah.
That's why then you go back to now, all of those 5 big buckets. If you are in relationships, if you are in a marriage where you're in it so that you might be loved the most, okay, that's a fig leaf. That means that your husband is a fig leaf to you, because it's all about you, that you've got to have something. If you're working, because that work is you loving yourself. So you're showing up and giving your all, or you're showing up not giving really anything, because ultimately you're loving yourself. That's a fig leaf. If you're using money all for yourself, it's just for you. And that doesn't mean that again, and we'll see this with Cain and Abel, that doesn't mean that you don't give to God. It just means that you see money as it's a way for me to love myself supremely. Yeah. And then when that's, and I really did want to mention substances, because when all else fails, what we turn to in our culture is substances to numb the pain of shame. But if you're doing anything out of a supreme love for yourself, whatever that is your fig leaf. Yeah. And if you actually are prideful about it and you're very hubris about it, that's what we call self-righteous, which is why religious people tend to be self-righteous, because they parade themselves around going, look at all of the things that I'm doing. Look at how well I'm attending the temple, how well I'm attending church. Look at how well I'm reading my Bible. Look at all of the verses that I know. Look at all of the money that I give. Let me look at all of the good works that I have done. And they go around going, look at me, look at me, look at all. And that's what the religious people did in Jesus' day. But their heart was so tainted by sin, the supreme love for themselves, because everything that they did, religiously speaking, they did for their love of self.
Man. Well, that leads us to this is the good news, the God solution. So the good news is that we don't stop with the bad news, but God's solution to human nakedness and shame. And really interesting, you said for the very first time, God makes an act that is redeeming and it blows Satan away. So this idea of like Satan overplaying his cards and not recognizing that that he would give them a second chance, right? Because he never received that. He never received the second chance. So, so God made garments of skin and clothed them. And you said Jesus is the ultimate act of love for God, ate the holistic curse of shame that was meant for us sinners, so that we might accept the abundant life that we were created for with God as his loving children. And this is where you talked about next steps for abundant life, and you gave us this idea of stop fighting, stop fleeing and praising, stop fixing, and start faith. So where do you want to go to here?
I don't know. Where you want to go?
Well, you're turning somewhere.
Well, I was going to look at Acts chapter 2. I don't have it.
Okay.
I don't have it underlined. Okay, yeah. So Peter's preaching. He says, "Fellow Israelites, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. This man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge. And you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. But God raised him from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death, because it was impossible for death to keep its hold on, him. But God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge." Okay, so, and this is where when you look at when you look at what God's doing with sending his son, and we do read in John 3:16, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son." Okay, but here's what we know about God, and some people have a hard time with this, but God loves himself supremely. Now, you have God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, the Godhead loving himself supremely. And people have a hard time with that.
Yeah.
Well, and again, I don't know how to articulate any other than the way that God has chosen to bring creation and bring humans into existence to share in that love, which is why he's sharing that love with them, and he wants them to love them back. But when you look at God's deliberate plan, he had this it is unconditional love for the human race, that he's willing to be long-suffering. He's willing to be patient until he can fully redeem. So he's willing, and then this long-suffering is now grace and mercy in action. So grace is giving someone what they don't deserve. Mercy is withholding something that they do deserve. And then forgiving is absolving. Forgiving is also absorbing the wrongdoing and absolving them of the guilt for what they've done. Okay, so God is forgiving and gracious and merciful in giving Jesus to be the sacrifice, to be the garment of skin for the sinful, unloving human race. Because I really wanted to show that at the main point is that we were unloving. Yeah. We were unloving. Now, maybe, and then if you think about it, okay, if you think about it this way, again, the levels of love. Okay, maybe you like God. Okay, that doesn't mean that he's the primary love of your life. Maybe he's a tertiary love. Maybe he's part of your life, but he's not your life. He's not your primary love. Listen, that is sin. That's sin. That means you're actually unloving to him because you do not love him the way he has created you to love him. So that's where, like, in God's eyes, if he's not supreme and primary in our life, that is unloving to the cosmic king who's created us. Okay, so when we were unloving, when we were unlovable, when we were enemies of God because we wanted to love ourselves supremely, which was this hatred towards God, God loved us so much that he sends his one and only son. Now, why did Jesus go to the cross? Well, the answer is yes, to die for the sin of the world. But he went to the cross because the Father sent him to the cross. And that's where I want to, by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge. What was his plan was seen in Genesis 3:15 that he will crush the head of Satan, even though Satan will bite at his heel. What we're going to see next Easter, you're like, you already know what you're going to preach on next Easter? Absolutely, Genesis 22.
What?
Yeah,
really?
So Genesis 22, where we see Abraham. God had told him, I want you to offer up your son, your one and only son, the son of promise. And Abraham was getting ready to slay him. And God, the angel of God stops him, and then he catches a ram in the thicket, and that ram is the substitute for Isaac. Well, there would be another human being. Be the God-man who was the lamb slain before the foundation of the world. So the reason why Jesus went to the cross, yes, to die for the sin of the world, but that wasn't the primary reason he went to the cross. The primary reason was because of his unadulterated, spotless, without blemish love for the Father, which is why he's in the Garden of Gethsemane. And he prays. What does he pray? God, if it be your will,
Yeah. Let this cup pass.
Yeah, but because if it was just for the human race, he ain't doing it. If there's any other way. So what we see, and so what we see with Jesus, and this is where I'm like, sometimes I wish I do have an hour and a half. Jesus is in the garden, and he has a choice, and he chooses supreme love of the Father, and he hangs on a tree. Adam and Eve, they were in a perfect garden with the choice. And they chose to eat the hell-bent, cursed fruit. So what Jesus is showing us is that in his ultimate act of love for God, he ate the whole list of curses. Now, here's another thing that's pretty cool. You ever seen Harry Potter?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, all of them.
Yeah.
What happens to him at the very end in the second... In the second Deathly Hallows, what happens to him?
I can't spoil it.
Well, it's been a while. It's been out for a while.
I mean, what if someone hasn't?
It doesn't matter. Spoiler alert. Matt's going to tell you what happens to Harry.
So turn it off if you don't want to be spoiled. He dies.
He dies. What happens though?
He comes back.
Why?
I don't remember. What was the reason?
Love.
Yeah. I mean, I was gonna say love, but what was the?
It was his mom's sacrificial love.
Yeah. Okay.
That's the reason why he has the scar.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and this is one of the things I actually do love about movies like this. What power raised Jesus from the dead? God's power. But when he died, giving his life, his perfect sacrificial life for the human race, that kind of love, that kind of love for the Father resurrects people from the dead. How do I know this? Well, and again, this is where I would have to, show you next year, which I understand people are probably going to forget this, kind of next year.
I can't believe you're thinking about this next year already.
So by faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered up Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned, verse 19, listen to this. Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. And so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead. You see, even Abraham knew this back in Genesis, that when you love God supremely, that love, God love, divine love, unconditional love, unadulterated love from the Father raises the dead to life. And so that's what we see. So not only did not only was Jesus raised from the dead, but now all who are in him, that's why, all who are in him, well, in the totality of who he is, and the fact that he is the one who is tempted to love himself. Because he had two, remember, he had two big temptations in life. The one in Matthew 4 or Luke chapter 4 with Satan in the wilderness, turn these stones into bread. Hey, won't you go to work loving yourself? Because undoubtedly the Father doesn't love you. Be hungry. And then, hey, won't you throw yourself down from here? Let's put God to the test, see if he won't let anything happen to you. And then, hey, listen, if you just worship me, hey, just acknowledge me. Listen, you won't even have to go to the cross. I'll go ahead and give you the kingdoms. You can have the kingdoms in all of their sinful glory. And Jesus chose unconditional love and supreme love for the Father. And then we actually probably see three temptations, because Peter's the one who also tells him, like, Jesus, no, I won't let you die. And what does Jesus tell Peter? Get behind me, Satan. I got to do this. And then in the garden, the weight of the cross and the weight of the sin is pressing on him, because he knows what's coming. He knows the wrath he is about to drink from. But then he says, not my will, but yours be done. So we have the King of Glory, the God-man, who takes our place. And his love, his life, his blood covers us if we receive him as King and Lord. If we receive him as our loving groom. That's what the Bible teaches. He's our loving husband. And so now, by receiving this unconditional love, it literally raises us from the dead. We are now spiritually alive. Now now you got to go back to all of these other things. Spiritually, we are now alive. We were dead, but now we are alive. We have been reconciled to God. We know whose we are. But then we have been raised in a new identity. We are new creatures in Christ. That the old has gone, the new has come. We have new characteristics. We have new attributes. We have these new elements that we are to represent and to mirror who God is. We have an identity. We have a father. We have a husband. We have an advocate, the Spirit. And so we have this new identity. We have this new functionality. We now know how to relate to one another. We know how to love one another as Christ has loved us. We know that whether we eat or drink or whatever we do for the glory of God. We do for his name. So I preach for the name and the glory of King Jesus. I lead for the name and the glory of King Jesus. I forgive for the name and the glory of King Jesus. I ideate for the name and the glory of King Jesus. I think through systems and structures for the name and the glory of King Jesus. I look at my time, my talents, and my treasures for the name and the glory of King Jesus. I want to steward my money well for the name and the glory of King Jesus. Now I have this functionality of what it means to be human that now has been redeemed and restored and been resurrected resurrected, now I have a physique, is that, man, listen, I got a dad bod. Okay, great, I got a dad bod. My God loves me just as I am. Yes, does he want me to be healthy? But he does not body shame me. He doesn't shame me because I got freckles. He doesn't shame me because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. He has accepted me. He has adopted me. He has grafted me in. I am his. And then psychologically, there might be days where I feel depressed. There might be days where I feel anxious. There might be days I feel nervous, but the King has resurrected me and I am his and he loves me. I don't have to perform for him to love me. I don't have to be perfect for him to love me. Here's what I know is that psychologically, mentally, and emotionally, I am whole in Jesus. He has raised me from the dead because it was his love. It was his grace. It was his mercy. It was his forgiveness. It was his reckless, relentless, unconditional love that has now raised me from the dead. I am his and he is mine. So I, as a human being, no longer have to live in a holistic crisis. Now, I do know that again, this is where it goes back to, and I keep wanting to repeat this because this is so important. It took God 6 days to create the heavens and the earth. So when Jesus rose from the dead, he ushered in new creation. So we're living in this new creation reality. We have been redeemed. We have been resurrected. But now what we're doing over the next, again, however long, those 6 days, were they literal in Genesis? Are they figurative? I don't know. But here's what I do know now. They're not literal. They're figurative. Is that we're in the process of this week-long process of Jesus bringing about new creation. And so there will be times where I struggle psychologically and I got to run to Jesus. There's going to be times where I struggle with my physique and I've got to run to Jesus. There's going to be times where I struggle with my functionality of living up to the standards of in some sense, being enveloped in my relationships and in my vocation and in my work with Jesus' love. And so when I struggle, I've got to run to Jesus. There's going to be times I struggle with my identity and I have an identity crisis. I got to run to Jesus. And so what we're doing now under construction of this new creation, we're learning what it means to be enveloped in God's unconditional love. We're learning what it means to love God supremely. Because here's the thing. Think about it this way. He's not even asking you, and this is what's so important too. He's not even asking you to love him perfectly. Jesus has done that for you. But this is what happens though. When we respond to the gospel, that Jesus has taken our place through his death and resurrection, he's making all things new. When we respond to the gospel, when we receive his unconditional love, we receive him as Lord and King, Savior. We receive him as our groom and we are his bride. Here's what happens. Jesus puts the Holy Spirit in us. He actually does redo and transform us into his new creation that's under construction. And so the Spirit of God now lives inside of us. And so therefore, if at any point we struggle to love God perfectly, guess who's there to bring us back on track? The Spirit of God is. And so that's where he's not even asking us to live up to the perfect standard of loving him perfectly and supremely, because Jesus has already done that. But what he's done is he's put the Spirit of God. So when we don't do that, he corrects us and brings conviction and we come back in line. That's the incredible good news of the gospel of King Jesus.
So, amen. Well said.
Yeah.
Well said.
I think, and I think that's a good time.
Great spot to end. Yeah.
Great spot to end. And then, as we do end, so think about it. So now, as we're under construction, God's unconditional love, because this was my big takeaway, is that we join him in remaking the world.
Yeah.
The church is the only people. The church is the only people that can give a glimpse and even a foretaste of this kind of world.
Wow.
And that's why that's why I preach the way I do. That's why we're serious about this thing called the gospel. So we're serious about Jesus, of loving him passionately and never getting over the fact that he saved us, transformed us, delivered us, and rescued us with his unconditional, substitutionary, redeeming love. There are a lot of churches that play church. There really are. I mean, and I say this often to people, is that not every church is equal. Because some people actually play a game. They play a religious game. They also play a superficial game where they're not as serious about the gospel, where it's more transactional, get you to feel good. But this is where Northland, we want to be a church that is serious about the gospel, because when we are, here's what we actually believe, that we join him in remaking the world, and we give this broken world that has been unraveled by their hatred and their enmity and their rejection of God. We give that broken, sinful, dark world a glimpse of this glorious world that Jesus is remaking in his unconditional love. And that's what we're about. So with that, Northland family and friends, happy Easter. So glad that you were here. And if you weren't, definitely encourage you to listen to the entire gathering, and definitely the message on making sense of the gospel. Blessings.
Thanks for listening to Extra Takes. Be sure to follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts so you won't miss a single episode.